Don't forget, you can reach the latest episode of Potomac Watch anytime. Just ask your smart speaker, play the Opinion Potomac Watch podcast.
From the opinion pages of the Wall Street Journal, this is Potomac Watch.
Welcome back. Another piece of this argument that the 14th Amendment and this disqualification clause applies to President Trump is that this clause is self-executing. And I think I understand what is meant by the legal scholars that are saying that. If there's an age requirement, for example, in the Constitution for a certain office, nobody has to pass any law to explain to people what that means. It applies to people who are younger than the age and allows people who are over than the age to run for those offices. But still, there has to be somebody to enforce that rule. And one of the arguments that you're hearing is that voters could maybe enforce that rule and file a lawsuit. As it happens, there was a ruling last week from a federal district court in Florida that concluded that regular voters in Florida did not have standing, did not have a legal injury to challenge President Trump's eligibility. Here is a piece of the order. It says plaintiffs lack standing to challenge defendants' qualifications. The injuries alleged are not cognizable and not particular to them. Another of the arguments that you're hearing is that maybe state officials could do it. And there is some precedent, I think, for that in cases where there's a clear-cut violation. So, for example, in 2012, you can go find a ruling by a certain circuit judge, Neil Gorsuch, and he is ruling on the case of Abdul Hassan. The brief order says that he's a naturalized citizen who wishes to run for the president of the United States. This, even though the Constitution says no person except a natural-born citizen shall be eligible to the office of president. And so he was kicked off the ballot essentially by the Colorado Secretary of State, and that was upheld by Judge Gorsuch, who said a state's legitimate interest in protecting the integrity and practical functioning of the political process permits it to exclude from the ballot candidates who are constitutionally prohibited from assuming office. Bill, I do think, though, that there's a real distinction between cases that are clear-cut and cases where there are not. And to Kim's point that once we go down this road, this will probably not be the end of the road. You can imagine somebody, for example, who was born abroad. A certain Secretary of State of the other party decides, well, I don't think that person is a natural-born citizen. And you heard some of those arguments when John McCain was running for president. He was born in the Panama Canal Zone. You heard some of those arguments when Ted Cruz was running for president. He was born in Calgary, Canada. And it's one thing for a Secretary of State to take that action if you have a 34-year-old who wants to run for an office that the requirement is being 35. It's another thing if it's disputed and one state official on his own deciding, well, this person is not natural-born citizen, so you don't get to be on the ballot in my state.
Yeah, as Kim said, it opens a Pandora's box because there'll be all sorts of unintended consequences. We're already seeing this. The standard seems to be use any constitutional interpretation, no matter how out of bounds to use it, it can be used so long as it gets Donald Trump. And as we pointed out on the page many times, that's going to have terrible consequences. So I think there should be a healthy skepticism here. On the one hand, it's obviously being done politically. Donald Trump's indictments have made him more popular in the Republican Party, probably less popular with independents and Democrats. And the Democratic strategy seems to be, well, we'll continue doing that, hope he gets the nomination, then use these things like the 14th Amendment to kick him off the ballot or make him weaker. It's a very cynical point of view, and it's unhealthy for the country to go down this route. I think that, as Kim said at the outset, the best case the Democrats have is to go head-to-head with Donald Trump. That's what the electorate expects. You tell me why you should be reelected. You tell me why you should be elected instead. And they're playing all these games with the ballot and stuff. The public, even if the Trump people can't get their man elected, the bad will and distrust will last for a long time.
And Kim, that's why, to my eyes at least, it doesn't seem like these two topics today are unlinked. We have the recent new Wall Street Journal poll saying that President Trump's new support in the Republican primary is up to 59%. And some of this overreach perhaps explains why. It is not a coincidence that as we start having these theories circulate, that there is some legal mechanism that is going to kick Trump off the ballot, that many Republicans respond to that overreach by backing their guy to the hilt.
Yeah, and the Wall Street Journal poll really highlights the game that Democrats are playing here, okay? They are using these indictments to make Trump more popular among Republicans. If you look at the Wall Street Journal poll, a question was actually asked of Republican voters. Do Donald Trump's indictments make you more or less likely to vote for him or no change? And among Republicans, 48% said that they made it more likely that they'd vote for him. 16% said less, and 36% said no change. So that's clearly helping drive that 59% number that you mentioned in the beginning. But then here's where you get to the rest of the Democratic strategy, which is they're very much hoping that these indictments do end up in convictions and problems for Donald Trump later as we go into a general election. And so there was another question asking registered voters, how would all of this affect your willingness to vote for Donald Trump in terms of indictments and convictions? 37% of voters said that would make them less likely, 24% said more, and 35% said no effect. So you have this ginning up interest among Republicans, even as though it's adding to bad feelings among registered voters in terms of Donald Trump. And this is what they're aiming to do. And I think the other thing you look at in terms of that WSJ poll is the extraordinary numbers showing Biden's weaknesses. How many people view him unfavorably? How many people have a poor view of his handling of things like the economy and the inflation and border in China? And this is all part of the strategy too, is keep the attention off Biden and his failings, keep it on Donald Trump. Don't have it be on any of the issues. Just keep it on Trump and mega Republicans and fears that they're going to engage and, strip you of your rights, etc., with no real talk about the issues that matter to people. And it's really unfortunate because it's a disservice to voters.
But it seems like a high-risk strategy to me, Bill. Again, going back to this WSJ poll, it shows in a head-to-head matchup, President Biden and President Trump tied at 46%, and President Trump well on his way to getting the Republican nomination. And so imagine that we have this kind of overreach, if we want to characterize it that way. A Secretary of State in some state that doesn't particularly like Donald Trump decides, I'm going to make the decision to make the jump, and we're going to say that he is disqualified under the 14th Amendment and he cannot appear in the ballot in this state. Well, imagine what the response would be, and not only from Republicans, but also independents, centrists, people who don't like Donald Trump, if that gets appealed all the way up to the Supreme Court. And I can only imagine that the Supreme Court would feel obligated to hear this case about whether the 14th Amendment does in fact apply to Donald Trump and hear it in an expeditious manner. And then going into these primaries, going into the general election next year, what if the Supreme Court rules strongly in favor of Donald Trump and says that this is overreach by that Secretary of State? It seems like that kind of court victory would only buoy him both in the primary and in the general election against Joe Biden.
Well, if you remember Bush v. Gore, that was exactly the reaction when the court came down for George W. Bush. A lot of people didn't like it. Look, our elections are designed to be settled at the ballot box and not by courts. And there's so many complications here, so many wrinkles that leads to all sorts of extraordinary possibilities of what could happen. We already are in uncharted territory. We're going to have a Republican challenger who is a twice impeached president, who is running for president again while he's indicted, running against an unpopular Democrat incumbent who is likely to be impeached as he is president. So this is not the way we should be settling our problems. I think all this is done for political reasons, short-term advantage, without any regard for the long-term consequences. And we need to get back to letting the voters really make the decision here.
But Kim, does the fact that Democrats are discussing these kinds of legal, extra political moves, does it betray a sense of weakness, of lack of confidence in their candidate? As the Journal's editorial has a nice line today, it says, when Donald Trump's opponents fight the former president in the voting booth, they have won every time since they lost with Hillary Clinton in 2016. That was the year of President Trump's historic, unpredicted upset. But then Republicans lost in 2018, they lost in 2020, they lost in 2021, they lost with many Trump-endorsed candidates in 2022 and didn't get the kind of gains that you would expect from the out party in a midterm year. And so why not just have confidence in your candidate? Other than that, Joe Biden is looking a little feeble and a little old, and they're not confident in him. And by the way, he seems unwilling to step aside, so they can't find somebody with a little more vigor to go head-to-head with Trump.
Well, because their candidate is in a dismal situation. Again, dig into those Wall Street Journal numbers. And I think, again, it highlights why they are leaning so heavily on the Trump strategy, because on their own side, it's a complete mess. In that Wall Street Journal poll, Joe Biden has a 39% favorable rating, okay? Only 42% of Americans approve of the job that he's doing. That's versus 57% who disapprove. They are particularly disapproving on issues that also happen to be some of the top issues for voters always, including the economy, the inflation, the border. Also in there, some very low marks for his handling of relations with China. 73% of those polled say that Biden is too old for a second term. And that includes 2/3 of Democrats. And by the way, Donald Trump, who's only a few years younger than Joe Biden, the number for him is 47% think he's too old. So that's a huge difference, 73% to 47. And one other number stuck out at me too, because it gets to those basics and fundamentals and why people go to vote when they're focused on records and achievements and policies, as Bill was mentioning, despite the fact that many Americans have a negative view of Donald Trump as a person. The Wall Street Journal poll found that 51% of those asked felt that Trump had a real record of accomplishment versus only 40% of thinking that Joe Biden did. That's quite remarkable. And so, again, this goes to why they're doing what they're doing. They've got a real mess with their own incumbent, and they've been unwilling to get rid of him and bring someone else in. And so they're stuck with this, as you note, high-risk Trump strategy.
Thank you, Kim and Bill. Thank you all for listening. You can email us at pwpodcast@wsj.com. If you like the show, please hit that subscribe button. We'll be back tomorrow with another edition of Potomac Watch.